When I walked into the house, I was shocked to see a biker riding on top of my wife as his most favorite vehicle. Now I will tell you how it all started. It started small, like an itch you can't quite scratch. I'd catch this biker gliding past our house in his matte black Harley every day around noon, without fail. I'd think nothing of it. He was just a guy in a leather jacket and mirrored shades, roaring past on his way to wherever. Maybe he had a favorite diner nearby or friends in the area. Who knew? It was nothing unusual in our neighborhood. It was my wife, Sarah, who first noticed him. "Have you seen that guy? The one with the Harley?" she asked one night over dinner, almost too casually. She leaned against the kitchen counter, her eyes flicking up briefly before she returned to chopping vegetables. I shrugged it off. Maybe he lives nearby, or likes the scenery. But her attention kept returning to that Harley. Whenever we'd hear the deep rumble in the distance, I'd see her glance out the window, her hand stalling on whatever she was doing. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Sarah and I had been married 8 years. We'd built a life together. Trust was the bedrock of our marriage, so why would I question it? In hindsight, maybe I should have said something. But how do you start that conversation without sounding like a jealous fool? Things took a turn when work sent me out of town for a month-long consulting job. A chance to grow the business, bring in some new clients, and the money would help us finally start on the renovations Sarah had been planning for years. She assured me she'd be fine. Her tone as calm and warm as ever. "Just focus on work. I'll hold down the fort," she said with a reassuring smile. A few weeks in, I noticed her calls were coming in later and getting shorter. She'd say she was just busy or tired. I tried not to let it bother me, but on my last night away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wasn't supposed to head home until the following week, but I convinced my boss to let me leave early, thinking it'd be a nice surprise for Sarah. When I pulled up in front of our house that evening, there was no welcome home surprise, no lights on inside, and no sign of her car in the driveway. The only thing waiting was the low, familiar rumble of a motorcycle idling down the street. I figured it was just the guy on his usual ride. But this time, he didn't pass by. This time, he pulled into my driveway. I sat there in my car, stunned, watching the biker's taillights glow red against the darkening driveway. His engine purred softly, filling the air with a low rumble that seemed to pulse with my heartbeat. He hadn't noticed me yet. I was parked just off to the side, shrouded in shadows from a neighbor's tree. For a moment, I thought of turning back, driving away until I could make sense of what I was seeing. But something in me kept me rooted there, a voice in my head saying, "You need to know." The biker turned off his engine and swung a leg over his bike, standing tall as he looked toward the front door. He was a big guy, with broad shoulders and a posture that screamed confidence. He pulled off his helmet and shook out his hair, dark, unruly waves that caught the last light of the sunset. I could feel my pulse quicken as he moved with a casual ease, like he belonged here, as if this was his house. Then the front door opened. Sarah stepped out, her face lighting up as she spotted him. She was wearing a loose sweater, her hair down and free, and there was a softness in her expression that made my stomach twist. She greeted him with a half-smile and a quick, nervous glance around the empty street. I watched in silent disbelief as she wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him into an embrace that lingered just a second too long. When they separated, she leaned back, a grin spreading across her face as she teased him about something I couldn't quite hear. Her laughter, light and genuine, cut through the silence and pierced straight into my chest. That laugh used to be for me. I didn't realize my hands were clenched so tightly on the steering wheel until I felt my fingers cramp. My mind was racing, caught somewhere between disbelief and anger, as I struggled to piece together what I was seeing. This was Sarah, my Sarah, the woman I'd spent years building a life with. And here she was, welcoming a stranger, a biker who'd been circling our house for weeks, like they shared some kind of intimate, private world. I had to stop myself from jumping out of the car right then and there. Instead, I waited, forcing myself to breathe as I tried to wrap my head around this impossible scene. Part of me hoped that maybe it wasn't as bad as it looked, that maybe there was some reasonable explanation. But when they went inside together, closing the door behind them, the last remnants of doubt vanished. I couldn't sit there anymore. I got out of the car and walked up to the house, my footsteps heavy on the gravel. Each step felt like I was crossing an invisible line, entering a reality I couldn't ignore. I reached the door and placed my hand on the handle, hesitating. Did I really want to go in? Did I want to face what was on the other side? But I'd come this far. There was no turning back now. I opened the door quietly, slipping inside. The house was dimly lit, with only a soft glow coming from the living room. I moved silently, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. I could hear them talking, their voices low and comfortable, as if they'd done this 1,000 times before. My mind was spinning, a haze of memories and betrayal clouding my thoughts. All those late-night calls, her strange smiles when she'd check her phone, the extra effort she'd put into her appearance even on days when we had no plans. It all led here, to this moment. I walked forward, careful to stay out of sight as I edged closer to the living room. Their conversation grew clearer, and I could hear Sarah laughing softly, her voice warm and unguarded. "You always look so smug after a ride," she teased. "I swear, it's like you know exactly how to drive me crazy." The biker chuckled, his voice deep and smooth. "Maybe I do," he replied. "Besides, it's hard not to when you're waiting for me." I felt a surge of anger rise up, clawing its way through my shock. How long had this been going on? How many times had she waited for him, just like this? The questions swirled in my mind, but I held myself back, wanting to hear more. I needed to know just how deep this betrayal ran. There was a long silence, and then I heard the sound of footsteps, moving closer. I backed up quickly, slipping behind the doorway, pressing myself flat against the wall. I held my breath, listening as Sarah walked to the front door, locking it. The click echoed through the empty hallway, sealing the house in a tense, suffocating quiet. I waited until her footsteps receded, then leaned slightly to peek into the living room. They were on the couch now, close, her hand resting on his knee. He leaned in, brushing a strand of hair away from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. The way she looked at him, it was a look I hadn't seen in years. My stomach churned. I didn't know if I could take much more, but I kept watching, my body numb, unable to move as she whispered something in his ear, making him smile. Then, in a move that felt almost like instinct, I stepped forward, my shoes scuffing the floor. It was enough to get their attention. They both froze, Sarah's eyes widening as she saw me. For a second, the entire room held its breath. The biker looked at me with an unreadable expression, somewhere between surprise and defiance. But it was Sarah's face that hurt the most, her shock, her guilt, the way her mouth opened and closed as if she didn't know what to say. "Tom," she stammered, finally finding her voice. What are you doing here? I thought you weren't coming back until next week." I felt a bitter laugh escape my lips, something raw and hollow. "Yeah, surprise." She stood up, her face pale. "Tom, I can explain, but I didn't want to hear it, not right now." I turned my gaze to the biker, who was still seated, watching me carefully. His eyes were hard, assessing, like he was sizing me up. "So," I said, my voice steady, "is this how it's been? Every time I leave, you just show up, make yourself at home?" The biker's mouth twitched in a half-smile, and he stood, moving with that same easy confidence. He was taller than me by a few inches, and he looked down at me with a quiet arrogance that only made my blood boil. "It's not like that," he said, his voice calm. "You were gone. She was alone. Things happen." "Things happen?" I repeated, disbelief coloring my words. I turned to Sarah, who was wringing her hands, her gaze flicking between me and him. "Is that all this is?" I asked her. "A thing that happened?" Her face crumpled, her shoulders slumping as she seemed to shrink under my gaze. "Tom, I don't know what to say. I didn't plan for this. It just happened. He listened to me. He was there when you couldn't be." I could barely process her words. She was speaking, but it was like she was somewhere far away, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. I took a step back, feeling the weight of it all pressed down on me. "What about our life, Sarah? Our plans? You throw it all away because of some guy on a bike?" Her face twisted with something that looked like regret, but she stayed silent, unable to meet my eyes. I felt a cold anger take root deep in my chest. The biker shifted slightly, moving to stand beside her, his arm brushing against hers as if staking his claim. I wanted to throw him out, to scream, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stare at this man who had inserted himself into my life, taking what I thought was mine. "Well," I finally said, my voice hollow, "I guess you two have a lot to talk about. I'll leave you to it." Without waiting for a response, I turned on my heel and walked out the door, letting it swing shut behind me. The night air hit me like a punch, cold and sharp, but I kept moving, forcing myself to put one foot in front of the other. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get as far away from that house, and from her, as I possibly could. I walked aimlessly for what felt like hours, lost in a haze of anger and disbelief. Every step felt heavier than the last, my mind replaying the same scene over and over. Sarah, sitting on our couch with him, the way she looked at him like he was her world. The betrayal was a raw wound, still fresh and bleeding. I had no idea what I was going to do, or even what I wanted. By the time I found myself back in front of the house, the street was cloaked in shadows. I stood there, gazing up at our home, the place we'd built together. I thought about leaving, about finding a motel for the night. But something pulled me back, a stubborn need for answers. I squared my shoulders, took a breath, and walked up the path. Inside, the house was quiet. The biker was gone, and I found Sarah sitting alone on the couch, staring blankly at the floor. She looked up when I entered, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. I sat down in the armchair across from her, keeping my distance. The silence stretched between us, thick and tense, until finally, she broke it. "I'm sorry, Tom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Sorry?" I repeated, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. "You're sorry? That's it?" She flinched at my tone, her gaze dropping back to the floor. I never wanted it to get this far. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "Then why did it?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended. "Explain it to me, Sarah, because I don't understand. We had a life, plans, a future together, and you threw it all away for him?" She winced, pressing her lips together. "It's not that simple, Tom. You've been so distant lately. Work has taken over your life. Even when you're here, you're not really here." I felt invisible. I felt a spark of anger flare up, but I forced it down, trying to stay calm. "So, because I work hard to support us, that gives you a free pass to cheat?" Her face crumpled, and she shook her head. "No, that's not what I'm saying. It's just, he was there when you weren't. He listened to me, made me feel wanted." The weight of her words settled over me like a heavy fog. I knew I'd been busy. There were days when I barely made it home for dinner, nights spent hunched over my laptop trying to secure new clients, fighting to keep our lives on track. But I thought Sarah understood. I thought she saw the bigger picture, that I was doing this for us. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice raw. "If you were unhappy, why didn't you say something? Why did it have to be this?" She looked at me then, her eyes full of guilt and regret. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I told myself I'd talk to you, that I'd tell you how I was feeling. But every time I tried, you were too busy or too tired. And then he came along, and everything just felt so easy with him." I leaned back in my chair, absorbing her words. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell her how selfish she was, how she'd betrayed everything we'd built. But another part of me, a quieter, more painful part, understood. I'd taken her for granted, assumed she'd always be there, waiting, and now I was paying the price. "So, who is he?" I asked, needing to know more about this man who had invaded my life, my marriage. She hesitated, chewing her lip. "His name is Vince. He's just a guy who lives a few towns over. We met at the diner one day, and it just went from there." I nodded slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. "How long?" "A few months," she whispered, her voice trembling. It wasn't serious at first, I swear, but it got out of control before I knew it. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Months. All this time, while I'd been working late, planning for our future, she'd been meeting up with him, letting him into our lives in ways I never could have imagined. Did you love him? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. She looked away, her silence stretching painfully, and in that silence, I found my answer. I stood up, unable to stay in that room any longer. I can't do this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I need some air. Without waiting for a response, I walked out of the house, letting the door slam behind me. I felt like I was suffocating, drowning in a wave of emotions I didn't know how to process. My chest tightened, and I stumbled down the steps, gasping for air as I tried to clear my mind. The sound of footsteps pulled me back to reality. I looked up and saw Vince, standing a few yards away, his hands shoved in his pockets as he watched me with a calm, unreadable expression. The sight of him ignited a fresh wave of anger, and before I knew what I was doing, I was marching toward him. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fury. "Haven't you done enough?" He raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I didn't come here to cause trouble. I just wanted to make sure she was okay." "Make sure she's okay?" I repeated, the disbelief thick in my voice. "You destroyed my marriage, and you're worried about her?" He looked down, his expression softening. "Look, I didn't set out to hurt anyone. It just happened. We connected. She needed someone, and I was there." "Save it," I spat. "You can justify it all you want, but at the end of the day, you took something that wasn't yours. You have no idea what you've done." He met my gaze then, something hard and challenging in his eyes. "Maybe you should be asking yourself why she came to me in the first place." The words stung, sharp and cutting, and I clenched my fists, resisting the urge to throw a punch. "You don't know anything about us," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Maybe not," he replied, his tone calm, "but I know enough to see she's been hurting for a long time. You can blame me all you want, but maybe it's time you took a look in the mirror." I glared at him, anger boiling under the surface. I wanted to fight him, to make him feel the pain he'd caused. But even as the urge rose, I could see the futility of it. No punch, no words could undo what he'd done. Without another word, I turned and walked away, feeling his gaze on my back as I made my way down the street. The night was cold, biting, but I barely felt it. My mind was a whirlwind, each thought more chaotic than the last. How had it come to this? Where had everything gone so wrong? I didn't know how long I walked, but eventually, I found myself at a small park at the edge of town. The swings creaked in the wind, and I sat down on a bench, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I buried my face in my hands, the anger melting away to leave only an aching emptiness. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out, seeing Sarah's name on the screen. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the answer button, before finally swiping to decline the call. I couldn't talk to her right now, not when my mind was a storm of betrayal and confusion. For the first time, I let myself think about what came next. Could I forgive her? Could we somehow rebuild from this? The thought felt impossible, like trying to piece together a broken mirror. But the alternative, walking away, letting go of everything we'd shared, felt just as unbearable. I sat there in the silence, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. Life as I knew it was over. There was no going back. Whatever came next, it would be something new, something unfamiliar, and I would have to face it alone. By the time I made my way back to the house, dawn was breaking over the horizon, casting a soft, hazy glow across the empty street. The light felt surreal, almost mocking, as if the world were continuing as normal while mine lay in ruins. The home that had once been my sanctuary felt foreign and cold, each step echoing off the walls. Sarah was asleep on the couch, curled up with a blanket around her shoulders, her face pale and drawn. She looked fragile, and for a brief moment, I remembered the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. The woman who used to smile at me like I was her whole world. But now, there was only a deep, unbridgeable chasm between us. I cleared my throat, and she jolted awake, her eyes widening as they found me. She sat up, wrapping the blanket tightly around herself, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Tom," she whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion and regret. "I was so worried." "Worried?" I echoed bitterly, shaking my head. "You don't get to worry about me, Sarah. Not after what you did." She flinched, her shoulders sagging as she looked away, blinking rapidly. I wanted to feel satisfaction, some vindication in seeing her guilt. But all I felt was emptiness, a numbness that seeped into every corner of my being. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my tone as steady as I could manage. "I need answers, Sarah. Real answers. Not just apologies." She nodded, her face tightening as she sat up straighter. "I'll tell you whatever you want to know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, I didn't know where to start. There were so many questions, so much I didn't understand, but I settled on the one that burned the deepest. "Why him?" I asked, my voice raw. "Why Vince?" She looked down, her hands twisting in her lap as she struggled to find the words. "It wasn't about him, Tom. It wasn't about anyone, really. It was about feeling something again. Feeling wanted." "Wanted?" I repeated, the words stinging. "I wanted you, Sarah. I've always wanted you. I thought you knew that." She looked up, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of sadness and resignation. "You did, Tom, but it wasn't enough. Not anymore. I know it sounds selfish, but I needed more than that." "More than what we built together?" I asked, my voice rising despite myself. "More than our marriage? Our life?" She shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "I don't know, Tom. I don't have the right words to explain it. It just happened." Her answer only deepened the ache in my chest. "So, that's it? You just wanted something more? And Vince just happened to be there?" She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping back to her lap. "I know it sounds like a cliché, but I didn't set out to hurt you. I never wanted any of this." "But you did it anyway," I shot back, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. "You made a choice, Sarah. A choice to betray everything we'd built." Her face crumpled, and she covered her mouth with her hand, choking back a sob. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And I'm sorry. I know that doesn't change anything, but I am." I looked away, struggling to hold back the tide of emotions threatening to consume me. Her apologies felt hollow, like empty words trying to fill a void that could never be repaired. But even as I stood there, filled with anger and hurt, I couldn't deny the small voice at the back of my mind, the one asking if maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. If maybe, despite everything, some part of me still wanted to try. But I couldn't ignore the truth, either. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I need to know one more thing," I said quietly. Was this going to keep happening? Were you planning to leave me for him?" She looked up, her eyes wide and haunted, as if she hadn't expected the question. She opened her mouth, hesitated, and then finally shook her head. "No, I wasn't going to leave you. I couldn't do that. I never planned any of this." Her words hung in the air, and I felt a strange, hollow relief settle over me. But it wasn't enough to erase the betrayal, or to soften the edges of the pain. It wasn't enough to make things right. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." She nodded, her face contorting with grief as she buried her face in her hands. "I understand," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve it. I just wish I could go back, change everything. But I can't. All I can do now is say I'm sorry and hope that maybe one day you'll forgive me." The room fell silent, her quiet sobs filling the air as I watched her, feeling as if a piece of my soul had been ripped away. The life we'd built, the years we'd spent together. It was all tainted now, marred by the presence of a man who'd waltzed in and shattered everything in his path. I turned and headed toward the stairs, my heart heavy as I tried to process the wreckage of my marriage. Halfway up, I paused, my hand gripping the railing as I looked back at her. She was still sitting there, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For a fleeting moment, I felt the urge to go to her, to comfort her like I'd always done. But I knew that wouldn't change anything. We were broken, and no amount of comfort could put us back together. In the days that followed, the house became a quiet, hollow place, each room a reminder of what had once been. Sarah and I moved through the motions of our lives like strangers, avoiding each other's gaze, the silence between us heavy with things unsaid. She tried to reach out to me, small gestures, a cup of coffee on the kitchen counter, a gentle hand on my shoulder, but each time, I pulled away, the pain too raw, too fresh. I spent my days at work, burying myself in tasks, staying late to avoid coming home. I'd tell myself it was just for a while, just until I could think straight again. But deep down, I knew I was running, trying to escape the reality of what she'd done. Late one night, as I sat alone in the dark living room, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I pulled it out, squinting at the screen. A text from Sarah. "Tom, I know you don't want to hear this right now, but I want to try. I want to fix this, even if it seems impossible. Please, just give me a chance." I read the message over and over, my chest tightening with a mix of anger and longing. Part of me wanted to reply, to say something, anything, just to bridge the gap between us. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I'd given her everything, trusted her completely, and she'd shattered that trust without a second thought. Instead, I put the phone down, feeling the weight of the silence settle over me once again. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, I began to rebuild, finding a strange solace in routine. I went to work, came home, slept, and repeated the cycle. It was a quiet, empty existence, but it was safe. No surprises, no heartbreak, just the quiet numbness that had become my constant companion. Sarah tried, in her own ways, to reach out to me, her efforts a fragile attempt at reconciliation. She left notes on the counter, sent me messages throughout the day, small gestures that reminded me of who she used to be, of the love we once shared. But each one felt like salt in the wound, a reminder of what we'd lost, of what could never be again. One evening, as I sat alone on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me. I'd been clinging to the past, to the idea of what we'd been, and in doing so, I'd trapped myself in a cycle of pain and resentment. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't for her. It was for me. To move forward, to find peace, I had to let go of the bitterness, of the anger that had consumed me since that night. I didn't know what the future held, or if we could ever find our way back to each other. But I knew that if I didn't try, I'd be haunted by this pain forever. And so, I took a deep breath, the weight of the decision settling over me like a heavy but necessary burden. Tomorrow, I would talk to Sarah, not as a husband scorned, but as someone searching for closure, for a way to heal. No matter what came next, I knew that I was finally ready to face it. The next morning, I woke up with an uneasy calm. It was the first time in weeks that I felt ready to face the wreckage of my marriage head-on, rather than letting the pain drag me down. I had no illusions that things would be simple, but something had changed. I was ready for whatever came next, whether that meant rebuilding or walking away for good. Sarah was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, nursing a cup of coffee. She looked up as I entered, her face a mixture of hope and worry. She opened her mouth to say something, then hesitated, as if unsure of her place. I could tell she'd been waiting for this, but even so, I knew she feared what might happen next. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice quiet but steady. She nodded quickly, setting her mug down. "Yes, of course." I motioned toward the living room, and we moved there in silence, taking our places on opposite ends of the couch. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor, her shoulders hunched as if she were bracing for a blow. I took a moment to gather my thoughts, trying to ignore the flicker of anger that still lingered. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I began, my voice sounding strange in the stillness. "About everything. About us." She looked up then, her eyes wide and filled with cautious hope. "Tom, I know I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to understand, and I know it's my fault. But I want you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. I want to fix this. I want us." Her words hung in the air, raw and pleading. I could see the sincerity in her eyes, the regret that seemed to fill every corner of her being. But the wounds were still fresh, and part of me wondered if they could ever truly heal. "Sarah," I said slowly, choosing my words with care, "I don't know if things can ever go back to the way they were. You made a choice that shattered everything we built together. And even if I try to forgive you, I don't know if I can ever forget." She looked down, her face tight with pain. I know I can't expect you to just move on like nothing happened. I wouldn't want you to. But I need you to understand why this happened. I need you to know that it wasn't because of anything you did or didn't do." I shook my head, feeling the old ache return. "You keep saying that, Sarah. But you needed something I couldn't give. You found it in him. How am I supposed to feel about that? How am I supposed to believe that it won't happen again?" Her gaze was intense as she met my eyes. "Because I learned what it cost me, Tom. I learned that no thrill or excitement could ever be worth the life we built together. I know that now, more than ever. I know that I don't want anyone else, that I don't need anyone else. But I know it might be too late to make you believe that." There was a silence, thick and heavy, as we both let her words sink in. For the first time, I could see a glimpse of her pain, a pain that matched my own, albeit in a different way. And for the first time, I saw that maybe, just maybe, she was willing to do whatever it took to try and make things right. "Here's the thing, Sarah," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I don't know if I can trust you again. Trust is something you can't force, and once it's gone, it's almost impossible to rebuild." She nodded, her expression pained but resolute. "I understand, and if that's what you decide, I'll accept it. But if there's even a chance, even the smallest chance that we can start over, I want to try. I'll go to counseling. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll even move out if that's what you need." Her offer hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of it settle over me. She was willing to fight, to put herself through whatever it took to earn back my trust. But I couldn't ignore the part of me that still felt betrayed, that still saw her with him, laughing, sharing moments that were supposed to be ours. After a long pause, I let out a heavy breath, the words slipping out before I could fully process them. "Maybe we do need time apart," I said quietly. "Maybe we both need to figure out who we are, alone, before we can even think about rebuilding." Her face fell, but she nodded, a small, resigned smile playing at her lips. "If that's what you need, then okay. I understand." We sat there, silent, both absorbing the enormity of what we'd just agreed upon. The idea of being apart was strange, unsettling, but I knew it was the only way forward, the only way to find clarity. The next few days were a blur of quiet arrangements. Sarah moved her things into a small rental a few blocks away, giving me the space I needed. We agreed to keep things civil, to avoid blame, to focus on rebuilding ourselves before attempting to rebuild what we had lost. She reached out, occasionally, through messages or small gestures. A cup of coffee left on the porch, a note tucked into my mailbox. I appreciated the gestures, but I needed to stand on my own before I could even consider reaching back. I threw myself into work, pouring my energy into something I could control, something that didn't require vulnerability. It was a relief, in a way, to lose myself in the monotony of daily tasks, to let the routine mask the ache in my chest. I kept to myself, avoided conversations about what had happened. I didn't need anyone else's judgment. I had enough of my own. As the weeks passed, the sharp edges of my anger dulled, replaced by a lingering sadness, a quiet longing for the life we'd once shared. It was a slow, painful process, but bit by bit, I began to accept the reality of what had happened. I began to understand that no amount of anger or blame could change the past, that the only thing I could control was my own path forward. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Tom, I know it's been a while, and I know we both needed time, but I wanted to let you know that I'm still here, still willing to do whatever it takes. I just need you to know that." I read the message over and over, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to reply, to tell her that I'd finally forgiven her, that I was ready to try again. But another part of me knew that forgiveness was a journey, that it couldn't be forced. And I knew that I couldn't make promises I wasn't sure I could keep. I took a deep breath, my fingers hovering over the keyboard before I finally typed a response. I appreciate that, Sarah. I'm still figuring things out, but I'm open to talking when we're both ready. I hit send, my heart heavy but calm. It wasn't a reconciliation, not yet, but it was a start, a small step toward healing. Over the next few months, we met occasionally, careful not to push too hard or too fast. We talked, cautiously, sharing pieces of ourselves, rebuilding trust one fragile conversation at a time. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, but we kept moving forward, letting the past remain in the past as best we could. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But with time, I found that the anger had faded, replaced by a quiet acceptance. I didn't know if we would ever fully rebuild what we'd lost, but I knew that we were both willing to try. And for now, that was enough. One night, as we sat together on a park bench, watching the sunset, I reached for her hand, feeling her fingers entwine with mine. It was a simple gesture, one that carried more weight than words could express. She looked at me, her eyes filled with hope, and I offered her a small, tentative smile. We sat in silence, letting the moment speak for itself, both of us knowing that while the road ahead would be difficult, it was one we were willing to walk together. Subscribe to the channel and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. Click on the playlist on the right to listen to previous stories. See you soon.